Okay, hopefully we have that technical issue sorted out. So I'd like to welcome everybody here out there in virtual land to this Sunday afternoon Dhamma talk. And we've been having a retreat here with about 10 persons, starting on the Vesak day. And today I'm going to want to give a talk on the kind of meaning of Vesak. And the banner that you see behind the Buddha altar is the Buddhist flag. And we put that up, usually that is put up on the Vesak day by Buddhists in various places. So we put that up as our small decoration to show the colors of the Buddha. Actually, these colors were said to be emitted by the Buddha on the night of his enlightenment, or the morning of his enlightenment. But so Vesak is a celebration of the three main events in the Buddha's life: the birth of the Buddha, and the enlightenment of the Buddha 35 years later, and then the passing away in parinibbana of the Buddha at the age of 80. So I want to try to show the importance of these three dates and see how it could relate to our own lives also. Now, a little bit of history is probably appropriate. Before the Buddha was born, he had been a bodhisattva and had lived many lifetimes in samsara. I think you all know what samsara is, the wheel of birth and death over many lifetimes. But anyway, it is said that way back many thousands of years ago, the bodhisattva to be, the Buddha, was an ascetic. And he was, in India, wandering around, practicing the ascetic life, trying to find the truth. But then one day he came upon the Dipankara Buddha. And he was walking along the road with many disciples following him. And he came to a mud puddle. There was a puddle of mud in the path in front of this Buddha. And the ascetic, his name was Sumedha at the time, saw the Buddha approaching this puddle with the disciples and had a lot of faith sprung up into his hearts. And he saw the kind of the majesty of this Buddha coming. He hadn't seen one before. So with a lot of faith, he laid his body down across that mud puddle so that the Buddha could walk over his body and not get his feet muddy. That's how much faith he had. And at that time, he vowed, I want to be a Buddha just like him. And from that day onward, the Buddha spent many, many lifetimes perfecting the paramis, the 10 paramis, that include truthfulness and patience, concentration, wisdom, discipline, and some other qualities. But he spent 10 lifetimes accumulating what is called the punya, or merits, and accumulating the the power, the mental power, as well as the other qualities of compassion and love and compassion that would be necessary for him to become a Buddha. Then the last lifetime before he was born, it is said that he was residing in one of the heavenly realms and waiting kind of for a right time to come down to take birth in his last lifetime where he would actually become a Buddha. So he took birth in North India. I think most of you probably know that, know something of his life, and was born to a king and a queen. And this is about 2,600 years ago now, about, or 2,550, give or take a year or two. I guess I'm not a perfect Buddhist if I don't know the exact year, but anyway. So he was born as a prince and he lived in the lap of luxury. And actually when he was born, 3 wise people came, or the king invited 3 wise persons to come to predict the future of this his son. Of course, the king wanted the Buddha to become an heir to the throne and to become king eventually. But these 3 wise persons, one of them said, this person will become a Buddha. And the king wasn't too happy about that because he knew that if he became a Buddha, he wouldn't become a king. And another one said that he would become a righteous world king. And the other one, I'm not sure what he said. But anyway, so the king, knowing that one of the prophecies was for him to become a Buddha, he wanted to make sure his son never saw suffering. So he grew up within the palace walls, and it's said that he never went outside, and they always kept him surrounded by beauty. And as he grew up as a prince, he learned all the kingly arts, and he was surrounded by, beautiful women, and then all the, dancing and singing and amusements, trying to hide him from any signs of suffering that might trigger his mind. But as time went on, and then he also got married, and the Buddha was getting wearied of this princely life. And because he had spent many lifetimes, of course, before that, practicing as an ascetic and already knew about suffering. But in this life, they tried to shield him from that, but it wasn't enough to repress these memories of his past ascetic life and his yearning for enlightenment, that vow to want to become a Buddha. So this gradually came out. He couldn't suppress it any longer or hide it behind amusements and surrounding himself and shielding himself from suffering. So anyway, the story goes that he renounced the palace one night, left the palace one night, sort of snuck out, not telling his mother or father, and then went a long ways away and cut off his hair, took off his princely robes, and put on the simple yellow robe of an ascetic, and then set out on his life of renunciation with the sole aim of trying to figure out the causes of suffering and why people suffer, and to find the end of suffering. Now, just to step back a little bit, before he left the palace, he also had snuck out and saw what are called the 4 Deva messengers. Because before that, he was shielded from seeing old age, sickness, and death. And the king had all sick and old people removed from the streets, so he wouldn't see any signs of kind of suffering. But this one day he went out, or night he went out, and the next day he saw these deva messengers of a sick man, old man, a dead person, and then an ascetic. And this triggered off his memories. And so this yearning to become an ascetic, the fourth one, the ascetic that he saw, he remembered that, and this ascetic was seeking the path of renunciation and seeking the path to truth. So the Buddha came back to the palace, and shortly after that, one night, he decided to sneak away to become a monk again. But he had to sneak out because his father would have prevented him from leaving, as it said. And so he went far away, as I already mentioned, and became an ascetic. And he wandered for 6 years studying with different renowned teachers of his day, practicing renunciation and asceticism and meditation. And the current belief in those days among ascetics was that if you deprive the body of any sensual pleasures and kind of tortured it, so to speak, that was the way to liberate the soul from the flesh and attain enlightenment or liberation from samsara or immortality or whatever their belief was. So he practiced those asceticisms, and he went around to different teachers practicing formless jhana meditations. And he practiced this asceticism to such an extent that he got so weak that he couldn't really sit and meditate anymore, and he couldn't really concentrate his mind. He was so weak, and he realized that is not the way to enlightenment, by fasting and torturing the body, and because there's various ascetic, extreme ascetic practices. And he also fasted, where he was eating, very small amounts of food that his body dwindled down to almost a skeleton. It is said that he could stick his hand in from the front, like over his stomach, and grab his backbone. He was so. So anyway, he gave that up. He started eating again, but not overindulging, just enough to get his strength back. And he decided to stop following other teachers because he practiced meditation with other teachers, and he practiced these formless jhanas. In other words, he would try to get his mind into a state of infinite light or infinite space. He could, by thinking of infinite space, he could create this mental vision of infinite space or infinite consciousness, but through the power of concentration only. And also another state after that. And it was very exalted, and most of the ascetics, they could do that, and they thought that was God. They thought that was the ultimate, that state of mental liberation. But when the Buddha came back out of those states of formless jhana, he realized that the mind fundamentally hadn't changed, that he was still stuck with the concept of I and the ego. And a lot of his past defilements were still there, like sensual yearning and anger or attachment and aversions in the ego. So he said, how can those meditation states be enlightenment? Enlightenment is supposed to be a state of permanent mental purity. So he left those aesthetics and went on his own, and wandered for a long time, practicing meditation on his own, and finally sat under the Bodhi tree, and then one night attained enlightenment. And he realized the Four Noble Truths. And that's what he taught. He spent 6 years, teaching the Dhamma. So the Four Noble Truths, the realization he realized on that night of enlightenment, or the morning of enlightenment, was that suffering exists in so many different levels. The whole of samsara, all human beings, animals, even gods and devas, they're all subject to impermanence. And everything that is born is subject to sickness, aging, and death. And he wanted to find the state of deathlessness. He wanted to find a state that was beyond birth and death. So this was his kind of goal. That's what was prodding him. So in his meditations on that evening, this is what he was contemplating. And he went through his step by step in the meditations, contemplating the dependent origination and developing the concentration. But he didn't get his mind stuck in those formless jhanas. He used it to develop wisdom and insight into impermanence, suffering, and no self. So anyway, at the end of that night, these Four Noble Truths, he realized that the true nature of suffering, the cause of suffering, that suffering can be brought to an end, and the way leading to the way to the end of suffering. So these Four Noble Truths are the basic outline of the Buddhist teaching. Because that's what he could see, that suffering is what, that everybody's life is emerged in. And that everybody is seeking happiness, but not knowing the way to get out of suffering.
Bhante, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but somebody's mic is on and it's constantly, there is conversation going on.
Well, I don't know. Turn it off. So the Buddhist teaching is kind of different from some other teachings. The Buddha focused on suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Some other religious teachings may talk about happiness and just, talking about finding happiness. Of course, we also want to find happiness, but people are trying to create happiness, but without understanding the cause of suffering. So like you could, like the Buddha found happiness in those formless jhanas. But when he came out to the formless, he could sit for many days in a formless jhana, blissed out, but when he came out, he realized his mind hadn't changed. And he was still stuck in a mind with certain amounts of suffering. So that's why the Buddha didn't immediately talk about suffering, but he talked about the end of suffering, the end of suffering. So he didn't have to talk about happiness directly. He focused on the end of suffering. Because if you reach the end of suffering, then it stands to reason that automatically you'd be happy. So that was the Buddha's unique approach. Anyway, so the importance of his, the fact that he was born, and that he was born as a king and as a prince, but he renounced that, trying to entertain himself with all the pleasures and to create a false kind of happiness. And that's what a lot of people do these days, isn't it? Everybody is trying to create happiness. Look at all the advertisements that we see. Buy this kind of car, this kind of clothing, do all these kind of things, and you'll be happy. And so people are basing their happiness in things that are subject to birth and death themselves. and that are subject to change. So people these days, they're doing all kinds of things to be happy. But in the end run, they come back home and they still suffer from greed, hatred, and delusion. And even money can't buy you happiness. That was a famous song, wasn't it, way back then. But most people, they're trying to do things to make them happy, but without understanding what the cause of suffering is. So that's why some people actually, criticize the Buddhist teaching on suffering. They say, why is the Buddha always talking about suffering? All of his teachings, first noble truth, suffering. Second noble truth, cause of suffering. Third noble truth, the end of suffering. Fourth noble truth, the way leading to the end of suffering. Where's happiness in that? And actually, one person, when I was giving a Dhamma talk many years ago, that was the question he brought up. I was giving a talk on the Four Noble Truths, and he said, I can't relate to this Buddhism, all this suffering, suffering, suffering. My life isn't suffering. And I said, oh, did you ever have any, troublesome sleepless nights? He said, well, yeah, my wife's kind of, cheating around on me a little bit. My sons are, getting in trouble with the cops and, this and that. And, oh, that's not suffering? Oh, no, that's normal, he says. So these kind of people find it difficult to understand the Buddhist teaching. But anyway, so the significance of, so we ourselves, even though whether you believe in the samsara and your mind is going through many lifetimes or not, but even within this lifetime, if you're 20 years old, 30, 40, 50 years old, you've been going through this cycle also. That we're from a childhood, we're seeking some kind of happiness. We grow up from a baby, we become a teenager, we try to get our happiness as a teenager, and then we go to college and we get our happiness trying to get an education and earn money, and then maybe get a family and trying to find happiness in that. But all along the way, sure, we find some happiness, we find some pleasure, but it's also short-lived. And problems always come back. And we have these basically three kinds of suffering, three levels of suffering the Buddha talked about. The level of the physical suffering. So just as you're born into a human body or any kind of body, especially a human body or animal body, it's subject to diseases, old age, and death. And no one escapes that. And everyone has a fear of death. And so, look at all the people that are suffering in this life because of the physical body. I mean, it's a very real phenomenon. Everyone suffers in different ways. So many diseases and illnesses and accidents. And we grieve and lament over our loved ones, ourselves, our loved ones, others that are suffering from so many physical ailments and problems and death. And then there's the mental suffering of this pain, sorrow, lamentation, grief, despair that's usually connected with these physical types of sufferings. And then there's some people that may not have too much physical suffering problems. I know some people that go through the whole life, hardly get sick, and basically have a pretty, pain-free or troublesome life, with the body. And there's many people that go through life fairly well adjusted in the mind also. But they may suffer from ignorance or not knowing the truth. So these three levels of suffering, the physical level, the mental level. Also, the Buddha defined the mental level as not getting what you want and getting what you don't want is suffering. So basically it means a dissatisfaction with with what is. We're not satisfied, and we always want something new. And even if we get something new, a desire, then we quickly lose interest in that, and we wind up wanting something else. So from the Dhamma point of view, that is also like a disease, this not being satisfied, not being content just to sit, and be in the present moment and in experiencing happiness. We should be able to do that. Because if you go and meditate, there are some meditation states you can get into that you can sit for many hours and be perfectly content with the present moment. But when you come out of the meditation, then the mind starts its old habits of, grasping and avoiding and other, disturbing mind states. So the the teachings of on the way leading to the end of suffering, all of the Buddha's teaching is actually called the middle path. So, this is a very radical departure from a lot of other spiritual teachings. So that's in one way why the Buddha was unique in that sense, that he was focused on the problems of man, the existential angst that everybody experiences, and to show that everybody has the natural inner power already to change themselves. A lot of other dharmas or religions depend on some external savior. They say, believe in this person, obey these commandments, and you'll be saved at the end. And so people, may do that. But whether they get saved in the end or not, we don't know. A lot of people who follow the teachings and live a good life, when they die, they think they've been betrayed or something, or they haven't, or they're waiting for the next life. So that's the main thing. People are waiting for when they die, they'll be born in paradise. But the Buddha said paradise is here and now, if we know how to tune into it. That means the natural pure vibration of the present moment awareness, or the natural condition of our consciousness is one of a unified state, or it's beyond birth and death. We normally think birth and death is a state of the body. The body is born, the body dies. Now that is what we call external birth and death. But there's also an internal process that's always going on too. And this is where the Buddha was very unique in his teaching, that he taught about the mind. And he taught about the importance of understanding our mind and consciousness, because that's really where we live. Other people, scientists and all that, they believe that we live on this earth. Of course, we are living on the earth, but they think that they're actually living on the earth. But for the Buddha, and that this earth is the world. But for the Buddha, this earth is not the world. The world is our mind and how our mind projects the world. So actually, we live in our mind. Our mind is what creates our experience moment to moment. Of course, this is not easy to understand with the ordinary mind, but this is what the Buddha taught. And the Buddha taught that the world, the arising of the world, the ceasing of the world, and the path leading to the ceasing of the world is right within this 5 or 6 foot long body with its nervous system, feelings, and consciousness. Because look at animals, our cat is living on this earth, right? but it doesn't have earth plane consciousness. It's not, it might see some of the same things, but it's not really, experiencing the world as we do. Or there's other people that can have mental problems, mental psychosis, and they can be experiencing a parallel world. They can be in this body on earth, but their mind might be totally consumed with visions, and they hardly have any idea that they're on this physical earth because they're in another mental world. So that's part of the meaning of that it's our mind that really is creating how we see the world. Whether you see the world as a horrible place, you see the world as okay, or you see it as in many different ways. So the Buddha gave the mind the most importance especially in terms of understanding the mind and how we create the suffering of ourself. And normally we like to blame our problems on others. That's what almost everybody does. They have a problem, they try to blame it on others, and they don't look within themselves to see if the cause of that suffering is within themselves. But this is what the Buddha wanted us to do. Sure, there are external circumstances for problems, but it's the way we respond to those circumstances that we can either create more problems for ourselves, or we can mitigate those self-created problems. And most of those self-created problems are through our forming greed, hatred, and delusion, and being caught in the web of sensual desire and aversion, or greed and hatred. So most people's minds depend on the external world for their happiness. And so they'll go around trying to do everything to get happy, but in the end, they wind up unhappy or not satisfied. And so that was the primary goal of the Buddha, was to teach people how to find that satisfaction in that realm beyond birth and death that's deep within our mind. So that's the unique feature of the Buddha's teaching. And he said that every being has that possibility to awaken from ignorance. So ignorance means not knowing the truth. Actually, it's interesting. Ignorance comes from ignore, right? Ignore. So when the Buddha uses the term ignorance, it means we're ignoring the truth about the mind. And it's funny that Western science, with all of its marvelous inventions and tools, microscopes and telescopes and electron microscopes and all these other things that can, see things that we can't, and have developed, the medicine and all these other technological marvels, they still haven't understood the mind. So Western science is primarily focused on finding, like finding the end of the world, for example. So we're sending Voyager spacecraft out to, the end of the solar system, trying to find the end of the world. Or we're blowing up meteors trying to determine what is the origin of the world by examining the stones and so on, or the rocks. So they're interested in finding the beginning and the end of the world, but only the physical world. But the Buddha wasn't interested in that. He was interested in finding the beginning in the world of suffering. And again, that's the major difference between the teachings of the Dhamma. So that's why but it took him many lifetimes to come to that realization. So anyway, his enlightenment, that he woke up to that truth about the mind, and that he spent 45 years teaching the Dhamma, and established the order of the Buddhist Sangha, and the teachings of the Dhamma. So the Four Noble Truths, the teachings of the Dhamma. I mean, he called that the Dhamma. That means the Dhamma is a word that has many meanings, but when Buddhists use it, we refer to it as the teachings of the Buddha. So he established that teaching, which has flourished down to this day, and the meaning of his enlightenment. That, see, he didn't profess to be the son of a god or somebody that came down to earth as a savior. He professed to be, in the past, an ordinary person like you or me, but through the inherent, deep inherent qualities that we all have, he was able to develop those higher powers of the mind, and to be able to use that to explore the mind and find out the truth about where the truth about consciousness, in fact. And even the sense of the ego. This is one of the deepest teachings of the Buddha, was about the sense of the I, me, and mine. Most people's lives revolve around I, me, and mine, and trying to satisfy this I. And that's why they get caught up in all kinds of unwholesome actions, and get caught up in the web of karma. So karma is another strong teaching of the Buddha, but it basically means the law of karma is similar to the law of gravity. If you throw something up, it comes back down. Or Newton's law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if we throw something out of our mouth, it can come back to us. If we throw something out of our body, like punch somebody in the nose, some reaction will come back to us. And even if we throw out our thoughts, thinking some negative thoughts about somebody, that also can go out and mingle with other minds and come back to us to have some reaction. So just in very simple kind of terminology, that's kind of how the law of karma works with our intentions. And that's why the ethics in following learning how to give up the unwholesome behaviors, that the source of most of our suffering is through not being disciplined, and by abusing others, by killing, stealing, lying, cheating, raping, pillaging, plundering, intoxicating the mind, and doing all kinds of things that have these painful results. So, the Buddhist teaching is laid out in the Noble Eightfold Path, is a complete teaching about training our body and training our mind in the middle path to eventually liberate the mind from this wheel of birth and death. Because this wheel of birth and death is going on every minute in our mind, even while we're living. Birth and death is going on. Of course, it's hard to understand that, but everything that you come into contact with, you're changing. So every minute of the day that goes by, you have different experiences. You saw something new, smelled, tasted, heard something new, thought about something. And in some little way that changed you, that changed your mind. Even just walking down the street, maybe you get up in the morning, you're in a bad mood, you're walking down the street, somebody comes down and hands you a flower and says, "Good day." Here. like, wow, it makes your day, right? You get a smile and you temporarily forgot about what you were, thinking about. And so that changed you, in a small little way. So that is also in the Dhamma terminology of birth and death. That means that we are dying every moment and being born again because we've changed in some tiny little way. Whether it's a good way or it's a bad way. Some people might get up and then do something very terrible that brings them a lot of suffering. And that also changes their life. We all know so many examples and hear about examples of people, how they're affected. So that is the way that the Buddha saw the birth and death. So that's what ultimately the state of enlightenment is about, coming to a state of purifying the consciousness where it's no longer being born and dying according to conditions. And there's a state called the deathless state, or nibbana, which is not a state after death. I mean, it can be when the person dies, but even while they're living, their mind still is can be in that state of liberation from those fluctuating mental states. So this is really the Buddha's gift to humanity, that, no one else hardly is teaching these things. And when we were born, like in this country or Western countries, no one told us about these kind of things. And especially the practice of meditation. So the practice of meditation is also one of the unique aspects of the Buddhist teaching. Now, of course, meditation is a popular word these days, and almost every religion and Dhamma says they have types of meditation, but in the Buddhist teaching, it's a very specific type of meditation. Meditation is focused on trying to understand our mind, not just to kind of get yourself into some kind of hypnotic state or something. But so the practice of meditation is the practice of developing concentration and insight to look deeply into our mind. So the Buddha was really a scientist. Actually, I don't know why scientists these days don't really celebrate the Buddha, because he was the ultimate scientist. But his science was the science of the mind. And he developed the techniques and the tools of meditation to a very high degree. And meditation is a kind of a scientific process, you could say. The Buddha used his body as a laboratory. He didn't have to go into, go to some university laboratory or, take 4 years of lab and all that. He sat down and used his body as the laboratory and his mind as the microscope. And he kind of looked down through the mind, focused his attention into the body and examined his body, into the various sensations. And he saw how his body was comprised of billions of cells, atoms, and molecules. He did that all with his mental microscope. And then he turned it on to the mind. He applied that power of concentration in the microscope to understanding the mental process of feeling, perception, volition, and even how consciousness arises. Now, hardly any, scientist these days, ever talks about that or does that or even knows about it. Of course, some now are, because they're studying the teachings of the Buddha. But I'm just saying this to try to show that, the Buddha was also a scientist, and he was interested in the science of suffering and how to end the suffering. Now, of course, medicine is also trying to end suffering, but they're doing it in other ways. They're doing it through trying to give drugs and operations and so many things. And okay, that's good. But a lot of times the suffering and pain comes back. And of course, their type of medicine doesn't end birth and death altogether either. So the Buddhist type of medicine ultimately even terminates the process of being born again and again and again to attain sort of liberation. So this is, it's quite new to, especially the Western world. Now in India and other Buddhist countries, they've known the Buddhist teaching for, 2,000 years, but in this country, until about 1970s, Buddhism was hardly known about. The Dhamma was hardly even known until teachers and books started being translated. We found out about it. And it's like the first time I read something about the Buddha Dhamma, I said, wow, where did this come from? How come I haven't heard of this before? I mean, this is back in the 70s when there was hardly any books. So now, of course, people can find it anywhere. But in those days, it was like, wow, this is something completely new. But it triggered something inside, some affinity, like I have heard this before, but I don't know where. And then that's what ultimately probably got me to, go to India, where I then, contacted the Dhamma and was able to learn it in a more deep way. But so this, the teachings have been preserved down to this day, thanks to out of the compassion of the Buddha taking birth. He could have stayed in the Tusita heaven for millions of more years and without deciding to come down, but out of compassion, he decided to leave that heavenly world and come down to teach the Dhamma, the path to liberation. And then he passed away. What's the meaning of his passing away? I mean, he was 80 years old. His body was already getting old. But he actually told one of his disciples that if he really wanted to, he could prolong his life with the power of his mind. He could prolong his life for, even a longer period of time. But he didn't want his disciples to get too attached to him. He had already taught the Dhamma. Already hundreds and thousands of monks and nuns had attained various stages of enlightenment. The Sangha was quite well established. And so he didn't want people clinging on to them. In fact, there was one sick monk who was about to die, and he told the other monks, he said, oh, I want to see the Buddha one last time. Really, I want to see the Buddha's body one last time. Please go and tell the Buddha to come visit me. So these monks went and told the Buddha. So out of compassion, the Buddha came and went into the monk's room. And the monk saw the Buddha, and he struggled to kind of sit up, and he was trying to, bow to the Buddha. And the Buddha said, enough, Vakali. Don't bother yourself. You don't need to bow to this meat bone body. This is not the Buddha. He said, whoever sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. Whoever sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma. So that's how the Buddha kind of, took that. And this monk kind of wakened up and understood that. So that's what the Buddha wanted to understand, that the Buddha is not the body. He's the embodiment of the truth. And that everybody who really wanted to could also become a Buddha, or at least to become, to reach liberation, basically. So the word enlightenment is also sometimes a little bit obscure, enlightenment, but I think the word liberation is more appropriate, because we become liberated from the shackles or the bonds that keep our mind locked or imprisoned in the cycle of repeated habits and accumulating karma that keeps our mind wandering through the realms of samsara. So to become liberated, even liberated from the ego, which is the deepest level of bondage, the being clinging to that thought of I, me, and mine, because that is what generates all of our actions and greed and hatred, and it's the ego that causes so much problems in the world, trying to defeat others and so on. So his passing away into Parinibbana. Also, when he was dying, he was 80 years old, he was dying in this place, laying under some trees, and it said that flowers were raining down out of season. These flowers that normally bloomed at a different time, but they were, and these three events actually were said to have all occurred on the full moon day of May. And that's why this week we had the full moon just last Sunday, and that's why that is the Vesak day. So in India, that was a time when these blooms maybe have come down. But so these blooms are coming down, and all these people were coming out from the villages and crying, "Oh, the Buddha is leaving us! The Buddha is leaving us! Oh, the light of the world is leaving!" And there was one monk who didn't join in all that mourning, and he was sitting some distance away in the forest meditating. And some of the other monks kind of got disturbed. Why is that monk, coming over here and paying his last respects to the Buddha, sitting over there, just by himself meditating? So somebody came and told the Buddha. And the Buddha said, "That's my real disciple. That's how you worship the Buddha, is by practicing the meditation, not by offering me flowers and weeping over this old decrepit body that's going to die." So, and again, he said, "Look, I've taught you the Dhamma, I've established the Dhamma, there's so many arahants here, teachers, let me go rest in peace." Of course, his mind, there's no ego there, but so his mind attained, actually, they don't say the Buddha died. Actually, in the Buddhist terminology, we don't say the Buddha died. So, I mean, people do say it, but it's not the appropriate word. They say he attained the parinibbana, because birth and death applies to the ego and to the conditioned states. But the mind of an enlightened person has gone beyond the birth and death. So it's already died before the physical body died. So the Buddha actually died before he died. That means the mind died to greed, hatred, and delusion. The mind died to thoughts of I, me, and mine. And that is called what we would call the ego death. And that in the Dhamma is the real death. Leaving this body is nothing. So this is, the Buddha's legacy was of this, and to show that he wasn't really dying. His mind was attaining the highest bliss of Nibbana. And so there's no need to grieve about it. And that's the importance of his death also, that he didn't want to go on living just so his disciples would keep following him around and, clinging to him. He wanted them to practice the Dhamma. So that's the significance of those three events in the life of the Buddha: the birth, meaning that we're all born into suffering, but the fact that we can, by tapping into the powers of our mind, we can attain that liberation and freedom from suffering, even in this life, and then we can pass away without any hankering or longing or attachments, and attain that state of the deathless state. know, it's hard to explain what that is, but you know, it is a state that is there, but there's no individual in that state. Let's leave it at that, so to speak. So anyway, friends, this is what I wanted to share with you in this talk, and I wanted to encourage all of you to continue your practice of meditation, and to, because that's the only way that you really taste the Dhamma, is by practicing meditation. And when you gain states of concentration and insight, then you start to experience altered states of consciousness. And it's only through that and observing how your mind is shifting between different states and kind of learn the mechanism of consciousness, that gives you a lot of profound joy. And again, it's sort of like a scientist. When we practice meditation, we're like mental scientists. And when you start to understand deeper things about your own consciousness, and especially how the consciousness can detach itself from all of its neurotic or negative thoughts and perceptions, and enter into a state of pure awareness and experience that total contentment, but being able to also live in the world. So as meditators, we're not practicing so we can remove ourselves from the world. We're practicing so we can live in the world, but not be affected by what's going on in the world. And we can live our life, but not succumb to all of the lures and temptations, or let our mind get dragged into unnecessary types of arguments and other kinds of things. And we can practice compassion for all beings, and we can, through our life, try to help others the best we can, to also hopefully try to understand the Dhamma, and to to be able to change their life in a good way also. So this was the message of the Buddha, and that's what I wanted to share with you on this Vesak day. So for those who are here at this retreat, we will be continuing on our last day of meditation for this retreat, which finishes tomorrow. And for those out there in Zoom land or on YouTube Live, I encourage you also after this, we're not going to be broadcasting this next meditation. We're going to end this Zoom and YouTube Live broadcast now, but I encourage you to go ahead and practice some meditation this afternoon and continue on in your daily lives. And next week I'll be back on our regular Wednesday evening Zoom Sutta study class, and next Sunday for our continuation of our normal Sunday 2:00 Zoom program. Okay, so I wish you all the best, and Namo Buddhaya.
Namo Buddhaya, Bhante.